Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. In the spirit of the trees, in the spirit of living nature, with deep gratitude for all the generations before us who have brought us to the present moment, I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising. Today, we're going to explore the complement to the Sustainable Development Goals. You'll all remember that back around the year 2000, as the United Nations and the world community were preparing for the Millennium Summit of Heads of State. That was the largest gathering in history of heads of state that occurred in September of 2000 in New York under the auspices of the United Nations. The leaders of the world, the countries of the world, committed themselves to what they called the Millennium Development Goals, which was largely around poverty reduction around the planet. These were adopted, evolved, and finally came to be reshaped 10, 15 years later into the Sustainable Development Goals. 17 Sustainable Development Goals in different areas of human concern where radical and dramatic improvement needs to be made in education, in health, in economics, in politics, in international cooperation, ecology, the sea, the land, the atmosphere. And those Sustainable Development Goals have been an organizing principle for the human community. Uneven, to be sure, problematic. There's been very little development in some and fairly substantial development in others. Many countries have just ignored it altogether. Others have taken it very, very seriously. So when you bring about 200 countries together with the different cultures and languages and political economies, nothing is straightforward. And yet at the same time, there was a movement as well to say that the Sustainable Development Goals, dealing with the externals, I would say, of the human condition, needed to be balanced with a similar commitment to the interior, to the inner development goals, the soft skills, the way people be. It's so that it's not so much what you do and what you know, it's who you are that is of critical, equal importance to any kind of holistic future for the human race. That we need to, for the first time in our historical development, not just deal with economics and politics, treaties that organize us between ourselves, but we need a deep and abiding commitment to our interior development because that is crucial, particularly in a world after 2 years of the pandemic and now war in the Ukraine, where the external environment is getting increasingly turbulent. We need to have a compensatory, commensurate deepening of the human psyche and soul to be able to navigate successfully in an increasingly complex and fragile world. So today we're going to dive into the inner development goals with the gentleman who has been the founder and really the key global leader in this domain. And so I'll introduce him in a moment. But before we dive in, let's go into our interior. Let's just take a moment and center ourselves in our bodies. Close your eyes if you can and take a breath and center yourself in your heart. For the next minute, commune with your heart, feel your interior. Connect with the interior of people you know in a spirit of gratitude and thanksgiving that we're all alive at this crucial moment in the human journey. Thank you, everyone. And now it's my pleasure to introduce you to Jan Artem Henriksen, originally from Ukraine, but brought by his mother when she remarried to Sweden, where he's lived all his life, but with deep familial and ethnic roots to Ukraine. The village where he came from is right now in one of the battle zones of that conflict. So when we talk about inner development goals, this is something that's very real to Jan. He has been in the corporate sector for many, many years. He was the founder of Thought Leaders, which trained globally over 70,000 people in different forms of leadership. He's been very concentrated on the interior journey and founded the Inner Development Goals as a nonprofit based in Stockholm, which is working with governments and corporations around the world in developing a parallel process, I would say, to the Sustainable Development Goals. So Jan, really appreciate you taking the time out of what I know is a very busy schedule to talk with us here at Humanity Rising today. Jan is going to make a presentation about the Inner Development Goals. And then when he finishes, as we often do here on Humanity Rising, I'll circle back. I'll be monitoring the comments that anyone has in the chat, and then we'll have a dialogue for the balance of our time. But Jan, thank you for joining us and welcome to Humanity Rising.
Thanks for having me, Jim. It's an honor to be here. And thank you for that minute of centering. I think it's important, and especially for me in these times, to find back to the heart and to the willingness to do something from a space of calm and good intention. So first of all, there are many people who initiated this. So when you say that I'm the founder of Inner Development Goals, there's a part of me that goes, we are several organizations and many people who has initiated it. I had the honor to be an executive director in this phase as this initiative is going global. And my relationship to skills and capacity building that I've been engaged in big parts of my life is not from the side of being an expert, but from the side of being a subject that lacks the necessary skills to stay in touch with the people I love. As you said, I still have family in Ukraine. My father is in Crimea. For many years, they haven't talked to each other and not due to lack of love, but due to lack of skills in communicating and holding conflict and holding contradictory perspectives. And for me, the journey of building skills have been very personal. It's been a journey of getting skills that I need to stay in touch with the people that I love. But it's also been the question of how can we do this on scale so more people can be in touch with larger parts of themselves and the world. And of course, when the war broke out, as many people, especially when something very personal like this happens, you ask yourself, does it really matter what I do? Is this the best way that I could invest my time? And actually, it was a very short crisis, because only a few days later, I understood yes, because when I saw the people in Russia, also the opposition, and there were some generals who wrote an open letter going against Putin and saying that many people in the military think this is madness and they don't think that this is the right way to go, and how it took them. The generals were in their 70s, and it took them 70 years to find their inner compass, the courage. Of course, their careers, their children's careers were at stake in writing a letter like that. But for me, it sparked something. It sparked that I know that we plant seeds of human development and wisdom early on. And if we can do that on scale, if we can have more people standing up for what they believe in, hopefully we can have less of this awful conflicts that we see today, and wars and many other global challenges that we face. So for me, this is highly personal, but also something that I've spent most of my professional life in. And I like to invite you to a journey of reflection. Also, as I speak about this project and the inner development goals, I will post questions, and I hope you want to reflect on them. And maybe you can bring something with you. Maybe you find new skills that you're curious about developing, or new perspectives, or something like that. And the first question that I would like to start with is, if you just think back the last, let's say, 5 years of your life, what are the skills, if you would name or try to name some of the skills that you have been trying to develop, that you have been consciously working on? I think many of us in this community are interested in human development, and we work consciously on ourselves. So if you are in the Zoom chat, please write in the chat, or just think for yourself, or write on a piece of paper. What are some of the skills, maybe 2 or 3, that you've been consciously working on to develop? And we'll come back to that. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to talk about the Inner Development Goals initiative that is initiated by the new division, which is an agency for sustainability. It's actually the guys that made the communication language logo for the 17 sustainable development goals that you recognize so well. It's a Swede, Jacob Trollbeck, and his company, Trollbeck and Company, who has done that whole communication language. That is, of course, working with us on the inner development goals also, and are some of the initiators. 29K, that is an app for personal development. That is also an NGO. It's free of charge. It's open source. That's trying to make human development available for everybody, free of charge. And it's Oak Island Foundation, or Eksaret. That is a small foundation in Sweden that has an island where we had many thought leaders gatherings with people from around the world, experts in science, in wisdom, who gathered and co-created different projects and initiatives. So just to frame what Jim was saying also, why do we need this deepening of our skills and relationships to ourselves? I think many of you heard about the phrase VUCA, that the world is becoming volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. But since the pandemic, there is a new term, a new acronym around, which is called BANI. I think some of you may have heard about this, that the world is brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and sometimes incomprehensible. So, and showing that it's actually our sense making that is getting crumbled. It's more and more hard for us to navigate this world. And we need frameworks to help us both in the external and in ways in which we relate to ourselves and each other. And here I think that we all know and recognize these beautiful 17 sustainable development goals. And we also understand that, of course, the world does not consist of 17 boxes. They don't exist. It's a way for us to make sense of the complex systems and make them more comprehensible, and also to help us communicate and navigate towards those sustainable development goals. And for me, it's quite hopeful, even though with many of these sustainable development goals, we are sometimes even moving in the wrong direction, as Jim said. It's still one of the first really global paradigms that most people buy into and relate to and understand, and many have seen, and especially in big corporations or people in institutions who might have the biggest effects on these goals, we can at least relate and talk about them and have the same language. So the idea came up, or from the understanding that, of course, most of these challenges, if we look at them, they're not technical. It's not that we lack some kind of technique, or it's more adaptable challenges where we humans need to change our ways of being, our way of collaborating in order to achieve this. But except for quality education, the inner shifts that needs to happen that are maybe stopping us from achieving this sustainable development goals are not really on the map. And our question was, can we do the same thing? Can we start a very mad project where we involve some of the best scientists in the world and start to co-create a framework that would simplify human development? And of course, it will never catch the complexity of human development fully, just like this doesn't catch the complexities out there in the world. But to have a language that is simple enough for most people to relate to, so we could talk about human development, and especially we could develop in so many different directions, but especially look at what is the development needed for us to increase our chances of reaching the sustainable development goals. So with that, we initiated the project. We had thought leaders on the island, together with Bob Keegan from Harvard, Otto Scharmer, Amy Edmondson, Peter Senge, many others that you know of that has been working in these fields for years. And we start working on a question. And as Einstein said, if you have 1 hour to solve a problem, spend most of your time defining the question. So it took us quite a long time to define the question. And what we did was we created a survey to
Jan, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but the Zoom interface, we see it as gray boxes. Maybe if you can go full screen in a different way or minimize.
Sorry, thank you for saying that. I think it's because I had the optimize for video on.
Right, you have to deactivate that for the other stuff.
Yeah. So let's see if we can. Do you see my question now?
No, it's great. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, George. So the question that we focused on is, what capabilities, qualities, or skills do you believe are essential to develop individually and collectively in order to get us significantly closer to fulfilling the Sustainable Development Goals? And here we reached out to more than 1,000 people working with sustainability and human development, and who have an expertise either from science or practice in this. And then we had 2 scientists coding, one from Stockholm School of Economics, one from Gothenburg University, independently coding all the answers, and then comparing their lists and trying to create big buckets of categories that were needed in order to make sense of all the skills. And I mean, some of the skills you already wrote in the chat that you've been working on, but especially linked to the Sustainable Development Goals. And then it took us several rounds with one group of scientists and one group of communicators in order to simplify the language. And we involved more and more companies who said, this is a very important work. We would want a framework that is not just our own leadership framework, but that actually simplifies and creates some stability in the field of human development. So we, except for the universities where we got on board, Harvard and Lund University, which is the Oxford of Sweden, maybe Karolinska Institute, a huge medical institution. You can see many big companies like Google, IKEA, Spotify, coming in and wanting to co-create with us. And so 30 plus companies got involved into this journey. And out of this, we started to see and get this framework that we will be talking about. So there is 5 categories of human development that we could find and 23 skills. And I'm going to go in and talk about all these skills and categories, and starting with the relationships to ourselves, the being. We're going to look at the dimension of thinking and how we can develop our cognitive skills and what are some of the sub skills there. And many of them, as you will see, will go from linear thinking to more systemic thinking. But of course, also what we started was relating to others in the world, broadening that, relating from the heart, caring, but also the actually very specific collaborating skills and acting of driving or enacting change, which I think is even a better word. And what happened is we're going to go into and look a bit deeper into the framework and the actual skills, but just some curious facts for you here. And it took us about a year in the first phase to create this first draft of the framework, which we will validate globally now, starting in September, because of course we have many biases that are both European and from North America. And then we said, okay, we need to look at also the different methods and how to develop these categories and try to create some kind of Wikipedia over how do you work with developing these methods and where is there good practice and good evidence. But in the middle of that process, we got a letter from a minister in charge of the Sustainable Development Goals in Costa Rica, Miss Pilar Garrido Gonzalez, and she said that we found your framework for the inner development goals, and we're really curious because Costa Rica has been making quite some progress in the Sustainable Development Goals, and we think this is the natural next step for us to work with and be implementing in all of the public sector. Could you please help come and advise us on how to do this in Costa Rica? And the very small initiative that we were quite overwhelmed, but still we got together a small film crew from Germany, actually volunteers. We didn't even have a budget. They said we want to follow this. It's something is happening here. So they joined me to Costa Rica. I met the minister, and now we have several presidents who have actually shown the interest in implementing this framework in all of their nations. Where Costa Rica is on board, we're speaking with Rwanda, with Greece, with other countries. And as we go co-developing this framework and methods, it's already people who are starting to experiment and apply this. So before I actually show you the framework and dive into it, I think I'll show a short movie to gain some momentum and inspiration around this. So let's see if we can get it working. So this is, we had a summit with around 4,000 or 5,000 people, 4,000 plus people in 50 hubs. So those who were having watch parties, around 5,000 people. And we created a small movie to welcome people to the summit. I don't think I'll show the full movie, but just to give you a glimpse of what's happening around the world. So this is from the summit in 29th of May.
It's necessary to accelerate the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. That is why, in December, we became the first member state to commit with the implementation of the IDG framework across the public sector.
I'm so happy to see once again Costa Rica in the leadership of this, because Costa Rica is also in the leadership of implementing the Sustainable Development Goals, and here's where we see also how it all comes together.
And Greece would certainly be happy to contribute. Let us all continue working towards increasing citizen participation, diversity, and inclusiveness, the cornerstones of what we perceive to be the IDG initiative.
It's really a pleasure for us just to, first of all, to join this global launch of the INA development goals. We think it can really contribute just to accelerating, implementing sustainable development goals.
I think we have a potential to improve, a potential to strengthen our interaction, be better prepared for the major challenges ahead.
To realize the Sustainable Development Goals, we need integrity, critical thinking, and relation building for collaboration in order to be able to take action together and to change society.
We simply cannot achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by only looking outside. The outside and the inside are simply no more or less than two facets of our lived experience.
All right, I'll stop there. So that we had Peter Senge and Dan Siegel and some others who are part of the advisory board on the Inner Development Goals. And you see that there is something here that is taking off. It's in some sense the simplicity in talking about human development. And I also want to give some warnings, some trigger warnings here, because there is also, of course, it's a simplification. And of course, it's reductionistic in some sense, because we can't reduce human development to a framework. We know that it's impossible. It's a very in spiral dynamics way of thinking, like an orange way of trying to find some kind of best practice. And it doesn't exist, of course, but it's a way that speaks to many people and that people can understand what the mystics and the others who've been fascinated about human development have been pointing to. And this is with this introduction that I would like to welcome you to reflect on the Inner Development Goals framework with me, if you're willing. So the 5 categories that we're gonna work through, and we're gonna start with being, and I'm gonna show you all the skills in that category, usually 4 or 5 of them in each, and then maybe share a little bit, some reflections or some on the science behind, and also ask you a question to reflect upon, and then we'll move on and go through all the skills. And what you can do also, if you're listening and want to reflect even deeper, you can try to think about each skill and see, where are you there? Is that something that you have mastered already? Would you like to improve on this skill? How are you? Are you low, medium, high on these skills? And where would you like to improve? Where have you already put a lot of work and attention? And where could you do more, or would you like to do more? Is that skill important for you, do you think? Okay, so let's jump in and look first in the category of being, that starts with inner compass. And the inner compass, the skill comes a lot from the 3rd wave of cognitive behavioral science, named ACT, Acceptance Commitment Training, where it has a lot of evidence base that many psychologists, when they look more deeply in what they're doing with their clients, is that they help them to clarify their own values and to step outside of the loyalties and systems that they've been embedded to, and find their own values and relate that to something good that they want for the world that might be different from what they learned in their culture or family or so. And here, of course, when it comes to integrity and authenticity also, and commitment to ability to act, there's 2 parts of it. And this is why ACT, I think, is so beautiful. There is first of all, the acceptance of where you are, and acceptance that if you are to live by your own values, it will include some emotional pain, and it will include different, also negative emotions, and we can't avoid them. We need to accept and live with them as we take steps towards a valued direction. So it's not only about knowing your values, which is of course important, but it's also integrity and authenticity, actually showing up and acting on them. If we look at openness and the learning mindset, many of you have probably read Carol Dweck's book on growth mindset, and here there are more and more perspectives that we can really learn and shift our mindset to be more open and to learn from different perspectives or different people. I know that Spotify is doing a lot with older managers when it comes to openness and learning mindset, and how to better embrace diversity, how to embrace different ideas, how it can be also, of course, challenging and uncomfortable, but how we can hold that in order to change and grow and have a different perspective to that uncomfortableness. The self-awareness and presence are, of course, key in the being category also, where being embodied and being in touch with our, of course, thoughts, feelings, but also body, but also not creating unnecessary suffering for ourselves or others by unrealistic self-images or inability to regulate ourselves when there is discrepancies between where we would like to be and where we are, or our view of ourselves and others' view of us or our projects, initiatives, and of course many 360s and many feedback routines here in the relating part can also help with this. It's we're never an island, and I think all of us, or most of us, of course, have tried or have a practice that helps us be more present and constantly work on dropping our judgments and being in this open-ended space that once you find it, it's so obvious, but for others it's just a concept or a construct. And how can we work with that so it becomes something real and something that we can actually work with and practice fully? So a question here for you is, if you would write your 3 most important values right now, or 5 most important, but we say usually that we can't hold more than 7. So which are the 3 that are most important for you right now that you're trying to live in accordance with? And there are many great exercises here if that question is hard, where you can find lists or do journeys where you can find more clarity on your inner compass and values. So just bring that with you. Okay, if we would go to the thinking category and look at some of our cognitive skills. And cognitive skills is tricky also, because many times when we talk about thinking or cognitive skills, people many times go to IQ and say, but you can't really affect that. You have some skills and you can't really change that. And IQ, I usually say there are 4 types of IQ. You have the spacious IQ, where you turn different figures in your head, and there is the logical, mathematical, there is the semantical, the how many words we know or how well we express ourselves verbally. And then there is this fact, the complexity way, not actually solving problems, but identifying problems. And when it comes to thinking, those that you can evolve least is the ones with the figures and with the numbers, the numerical. And the verbal, and especially on the complexity side, it's quite developable. I mean, you can grow there, and especially in complexity of your thinking. So here are some ways, and I mean, we do in our universities quite a lot of critical thinking and training in reviewing validity of news, evidence, and plans. And almost that we do it too much in some cultures, where we become too critical and we lose the ability to see the whole and appreciate the whole and be creative. But especially also when it comes to complexity awareness of seeing systems. And here Peter Senge, I think, is a huge source of inspiration for me, at least, how we can train to think in systems, but also how we can train in identifying problems, not only solving problems, but by working with different cases of really trying to see what is the problem here and how is it interconnected. When it comes to perspective skills, some researchers say that this is one of the most important thinking skills if you are to recruit a senior manager, that the higher management, the more important it is to make sense of contradicting perspectives and connect people in a way that they share their perspectives and create insights out of them. And here there is a paradox that people who are good in taking perspective, so taking perspectives is something else than seeking perspective and coordinating perspective. So if I have a quick brain and can see many perspectives easily, it's not necessarily that I will be good in asking others for their perspective. So you see, this can really be a trap, that I think that I have many perspectives on an issue or problem, but they're all my perspective with my bias. And then I don't seek as many perspectives as I could. So this is also really a skill that we can train and practice. And just like sense making and creating stories and making sure that that doesn't happen automatically, but that we say, wait a moment, what's really happening here? And how can we structure and understand this in a constructive and creative way? And of course, those of you who are interested in adult development and meaning making have heard about Susan Kreuter and Bob Keegan and their work, and how we can have more and more mature meaning making or sense making of the world, the more holistic or wise we become in our thinking. So basically, the most simplistic ways of thinking would be very black and white, and is it good or bad for me, and very judgmental, or looking for making social points somehow or benefits based on others' values, versus coming into following our inner compass or becoming even aware of our compass and our own limitations, and trying to see and understand the unknown through a more transformational point of view, where we see systems and ask ourselves, how do we help these systems interact in a healthy way? So it's a very mature sense making and meaning making. And of course, as you see, they're all intertwined. The long-term orientation and visioning is, of course, part of that, but also a separate skill where we can train to think 20, 30 years ahead. Phoebe Ticknell, who were at the summit, she did an exercise with us where we used our imagination to work with moral imagination, as she called it, where we met another person at the summit, and we stood and we looked them in the eyes and we imagined that the other person was from 7 generations ahead. And then we had to speak to 2 different scenarios, as if the world was really struggling and the humans hardly survived 7 generations ahead, and saying, how did it feel to be here now? And what took us there, knowing that this will be the future. And of course, a lot of shame and guilt and anger and frustration and denial and all these different feelings that get triggered, that also maybe stop us from being fully long-term orientated. And then she gave us a second scenario and say, imagine that 7 generations from now, the human planet and humans are flourishing more than ever. before. It's a beautiful planet. And please speak about what are some of the shifts and what have you done in order to contribute to that world. And it was very enriching to think at least 200 years ahead and think about some of the shifts and transformations that has happened along the way, and just to inspire people to do an exercise like that and to challenge us to think 200 years ahead or more is something that is very rare and unusual, but there was more and more research how we can be working and doing that. So a question for you here is, let's say, are you usually too critical or too naive? There is some people saying that we tilt to one direction. Are we criticizing things too much, or are we buying things a bit too easily? Which way would you like to move, if any, with your critical thinking? Would you like to have less of that and let go a bit of that, or would you need to be more critical in some points of view? Okay, let's take a deep breath. And we have another 20 minutes before we open up for a discussion. So we have 3 more categories to go through, and I'll invite you to reflect on them as we go. So let's go and look into relating a little bit. And there are 4 skills here, starting with appreciation. And I think it's interesting. I read a study about, a meta study about different sects, religious sects. And it's interesting to study them because people are coming together, relating very strongly. There can be more or less healthy, many times not so healthy rules in that group. And what the meta review said, or what the publisher said, was that, it's interesting. There are so many different reports of how strange relating and sects can really become. But he said that most of the time they would survive, even with the strangest rituals and ways of being, if there is a sense of appreciation, gratitude, and joy. And as soon as that community or sect lost that sense, it dissolved more or less within just a few years. And for me, it's something really, really challenging, but also interesting in that thought that, we can be in very many different cultural settings and ways, but how fundamentally crucial the appreciation, gratitude, and joy is for us to stay together and to stay connected. And the connectedness, I think Mother Teresa maybe was the black belt of connectedness and including people in her space of being. We all have, of course, for me, I'm from Ukraine. It's easier for me to care for Ukraine deeply and feel connected to that part in the world. But it's also interesting for me to see what communities here in Sweden that got involved in this war and humanitarian crisis, and to see that also challenging truth that many times it wasn't the people who meditated a lot who felt the strongest connectedness. It was many times the burner community, the people who have been in a lot of challenges, in festivals that are crazy, but many of them taking substances, but still to see them really connect and go to Poland and organize refugee work. And there was a cynic in my end where something really happened, because I've been to some of the burner community events and I was a bit skeptical, but then oh wow, wait, something happened with my way of including them or seeing them from another perspective through seeing how they connect to a larger whole and how that membrane was somehow loosen up for them enough at least to really, really act. And I could see how many of my people involved in the burner community actually did something. And it was, going back to Mother Teresa here, and, you know, she was asked to give a talk on connectedness and leadership at a summit. And I read about it that it was the shortest speech on the summit ever. She basically came up to the stage. For a long time, she stood there. She was old then and just watching all the leaders. And then she said, I have 2 questions for you. She said, question number 1, do you know your people? And then she was quiet for a very long time. And then she said, in question number 2 is, do you love them? And then she went off stage. And I think it's 2 really, really powerful questions that I want to ask you here also. Do you know your people, however you define that? And do you love them? So going to humility and empathy, you see again how they intertwine, and there are ways in actually how we can practice and train also the skills of humility and empathy. I know Emma Stenström at Stockholm School of Economics, she's doing beautiful research where she gets the students out to interview groups. She call it bubble hopping, groups that are outside of their bubble. And here I could just give you the exercise very simply. She says, okay, see if you want to think about a person or a group of people who you think are very far away from your way of being and thinking. If you're more to the left, it could be some far right people. If you're on the other side of the spectrum, somebody on the opposite spectrum of your political views or any other views. And then she says, write in your social media that you would like to invite a person from this party or who votes for this or that or have this sympathies for a lunch. And many times you will find that people in your social network would say, yeah, you know, I will direct message to you and say, I could actually have a lunch with you. And then she says, have a 1.5 hour lunch. And she has actually some guiding principles on how to do that, where you truly practice not to devalue or make jokes or somehow show your discontent, but rather understand that if you would have the same biology and the same experience, you would think exactly the same. And have that humility with you and practice to be empathic and ask empathic questions. Tell me more. How come you think this way? And so and so. And what she can see is after that 1.5 hour of lunch, which is not always comfortable and a bit takes quite some emotional regulation, that people come out higher on empathy and compassion and humility and with much more understanding that can be measured 6 months later. So it's a truly transformative practice that we can build into our organizations and ways of being, but that of course takes us to also uncomfortable places and perspectives that are sometimes in conflict with our own beliefs. Okay, let's look into the other 2 categories and the collaborating of the social skills. You can see the communication skill, co-creation skills, inclusive mindset, intercultural competence, trust, and mobilization skills. So just to start with a story, I've been teaching at Stockholm School of Economics, leadership and organization for quite some years. And for many years, I've said that I've been working against the school. And the last years, since we got a very good president, I've been working with the school. And something happened for our president, I think, where when he thought about artificial intelligence and Stockholm School of Economics is really good in finance. And when he realized that, okay, we need to prepare our students for the future, but the future CFO, Chief Financial Officer, will not be the one who is the best at working with Excel or doing very complex models. Because as it looks like, AI and computers and big data will be much more better at finding patterns in big data. And his realization was pointing him towards this category, where he said, so the future CFO needs to be a black belt in collaborating, in getting other people to work with him or her, to collect data, to be able to understand different cultures and not think that they are strange, to have an inclusive mindset and intercultural competence. And this, of course, takes us back to the first category of being, because if you're not aware of your own values, if you cannot take your own values as an object and look at them from a distance, it's really, really hard to relate and include people with different values, because you will intuitively find them strange and not be able to relate to that unless you can take your own perspectives as an object and think about them and see your biases. Okay, I value efficiency very highly, or I value whatever it may be that makes me frustrated with this person or this culture, because they have a different value that can be opposed to that. So this is very, very interesting to see how that connects. And I think it's also beautiful to see how co-creation comes up as a skill, and not just collaboration, but to really build like this jazz-like collaborations where we form the agenda, we form the purpose together as we work with diverse stakeholders and deep psychological safety. I'm also really, really happy to see some of the soft skills like communication skills and building trust. I mean, just doing a check-in at the start of a meeting or being vulnerable, how we use words and how we say what we say, that becomes truly important also if we are to collaborate together. And of course, the structures and some of the very simple tools to mobilize people and to engage in shared purposes. There are beautiful examples of frameworks or World Cafe or ways where different stakeholders can come together, find ways to understand each other and also see how we move forward. And of course, these practices need to be more and more widely used if we are to solve the very complex problems we are facing. So a question before we go for the next one maybe is, if you consciously are to build trust in a team or with people, what's your way of doing that? How do you build trust? How do you work consciously with trust? And the last one then, going into acting and into actually having an effect on the field. And of course, it takes many times courage, especially if we are to do something new or disruptive. And for me, a big insight is when I look into the different category, especially in the acting, is sometimes that we put it on the person. We say it's the individual that has a lot of courage or not. It's a creative person or not. And I realize more and more, the more I study and work on myself also and read about the research on these different skills, is that it's much more collective and systemic than we would like to, or than we imagine many times. Also courage, if you look at it, like one of my most, when I think about what has made me more courageous, if there is any courage that I possess, I realize it's been good leadership. people who have encouraged me to take risks. I had a manager who once told me, we worked for a few years together, and he said, look, Jan, I know you are heading off to do this startup, but I just want to tell you that whatever you do, if you ever need a job, I will always be here. You can always come back and I'll find you a spot, a managerial position, or if I don't have one, we'll start something. So just know this, that you can always use me as a fallback. And that small, very, very small gesture from a much more senior person, and I was in my 20s, who said that, how much it helped me to really lean in and dare to risk and dare to lose and dare to try. Because when I was most afraid, I always knew that, oh my God, Stefan, he has my back. I could go back to Stefan and he could catch me. And it's paradoxically the same with many of the other skills. Creativity is many times a cultural and shared process that we can really foster. And creativity comes from a well-connected brain that I also learned from Dan Siegel, and how we can work on that together to create more creativity in our culture. Martin Seligman has done a lot on the active hope and how we can work with learned optimism. Now I'm thinking of Macy, but with active hope. But here there is very, very many rituals, collective ways that we can support each other, even when it's hard, even when it's dark, to have that optimism and to have the perseverance, the grit, not to give up, to build that long-term orientation. And as you know, a lot of the initiatives, and if you look at leadership, it's not the smartest, it's not the most creative. Sometimes it's the most committed and those who have most perseverance who actually make it, because there are so many setbacks and we have this negativity bias in our brains. So a negative emotion or news is five times as challenging for us to take in and stays 5 times as long. This is why we have all the negative news in the papers and so on, because there is this natural negativity bias. And if we are to change patterns, we're going to face a lot of that. And we really need these 4 clusters of skills, I would say. So the last question before I start rounding off this presentation is, if you would meet a future version of yourself, what courageous actions would he or she or that person tell you to do today if you would meet a future version of yourself? Okay, so here is the framework in its whole. You can find it on innerdevelopmentgoals.org. It's open source, it's a non-for-profit, so there are many resources that you can download and use. There is a self-reflection in 29K that we're just prototyping. And just a few words before I let you back in, Jim, to reflect with me on what's happening next. So in the phase 2 where we are now, as I said, when this Costa Rica case came in, we're looking on methods, and what methods do we have that are effective for building these skills and helping us to increase our chances of reaching the Sustainable Development Goals. We have already 2,000 plus responses in the survey. The survey is still out there. You can if you go to innerdevelopmentgoals.org, you can click on the survey and submit some of the methods that you're using and that you think are useful for some or many of these skills. As I said, we had around 4,000 people attending the summit. And here we're starting to also have IDG hubs, and you're all free to start a hub in whatever you are. And it can be 3 people meeting and reflecting on the IDGs, or like we have in Colombia or India, it's a university with some companies, it's 300 people gathering once in a while at that university campus or something like that. So this is what's happening now until September, which is focusing on the how of human development. If this was the what is human development? I mean, a very simple answer is, yeah, it's some of these skills that we need to build. At least these skills connect to the Sustainable Development Goals, if you ask many 1,000 plus experts. And what we want to do is we hope to put this on the web so that there is like a Wikipedia meets Trustpilot for different perspectives and methods that you can use and exercises for building different skills. And that we hope to inspire more people to have a more broader look on their own personal development, and also finding different communities and ways of working other than what they may have been doing already, but also helping people to find the practices that actually have effect in a way that is beneficial, and where there's hopefully also studies connecting this to, we're doing it, several bigger studies with the universities to take people who are working on the Sustainable Development Goals, help them develop some of these skills, and see if they find it easier or helpful in their projects with the Sustainable Development Goals, if they feel more engaged and more enabled to work with the complex issues. And the last phase that we're doing is validation and application, which we're coming into in September. As I said, we're raising capital. Here we need help to find supporters and foundations that will help us do a big global validation, where we hope to involve 100,000 plus people, at least 1,000 from most of the countries where we can collect data effectively, and maybe even more, maybe 150,000 responses, to really make sure to validate this framework and catch the wisdom of Global South, where we now have many blind spots and would like to get more people with research or wisdom or experience to feed into this. So this is what's happening going forward. So I think I'll stop here. And I have not been able to see the chat, but I asked Jim to help me with that. And I'll ask you to bring your questions. And I'll first check in with Jim and have a few minutes of conversation. And then we will also ask you to write some of your thoughts, questions, reflections in the chat, so we can reflect on them together.
Thank you so much, Jan. That was a splendid presentation, and there was a lot of excitement in the chat group around the notion of the inner development goal hubs, which means, you know, almost anybody anywhere can join in a way that makes sense to them as you scale. It's certainly needed, and I would imagine the urgency for the IDG process is getting more acute, given the fact that stress levels, anxiety, psychological, emotional debilitation is occurring literally all over the world. So people, I think, by the circumstance of current events, are being forced into their interior more and more, as just about everything that they thought was normal before, you know, March of 2020, and then in Europe and globally before the conflict in Ukraine, everything seems to be caught up in uncertainty and ambiguity and fragility, and people are moving into their interiors. Have you noted that in terms of the receptivity of the IDG process over the last, you know, even 6, 9, 12 months, as we've been all going through some extraordinary external turbulence?
I mean, for sure, I've been at the board of Eksaret Foundation for almost 10 years, or at least 8 years. And I mean, we've been trying to speak about the connection between personal development and societal change and development all these years. And it's been hard. It's like people have had a hard time seeing that link many years. And after the pandemic, or during the pandemic, we started doing these online conferences we called Mindshift, and suddenly people were getting it. Yeah. And it was like the time had caught up with us, and we were saying the same thing, but people were going like, yes, you know, like, whoa, whoa.
Yeah, it's become a personal concern. You know, how am I going to navigate this craziness?
Exactly, because we went through this collective retreat where we, and you know, also you can see it in even how people date. Like, as you know, I founded a dating app as one of the things that I've been doing. So I've been following the research on dating, and people started valuing inner dimensions much higher because they had to spend time with each other and really be. So it's become less superficial, you know. So it's not as much Tinder anymore. It's much more, wait, who are you? We might be locked in for 2 years together. I want to make sure that we have something that we can share or speak about or co-grow in.
Now, let me ask you a couple questions. First, starting with Hannah Gosnell in the chat about how the framework that you're developing, Jan, how does it deal with conflict resolution? Because that's what's going on all over the world, is when people are coming together in terms of that social category, people are in conflict. So how do the IDGs deal with that?
I think, to use an allegory, I don't think that IDGs is a medicine. It's rather a vaccine to if we talk about conflict, because I think there are many frameworks, and IDGs is more asking the very long-term question: what skills do we need to build long-term in order to increase our chances of not getting into conflict, of solving the very big problems? So I don't think it's there that the IDGs are at best. When we talked about of course you can make sense of conflict and maybe some skills lacking and other ways, but the way that we have intended, at least, to use it is more to say that this is what we need to do. And also, especially, I mean, of course we can work with the children, but there are good science showing that there is chances of working with leaders we have and the grown-ups, so they can handle conflict more in a more mature way if they have these skills. But it's not a way to resolve conflict or so.
And then another question that I was reflecting upon as you were making your presentation, particularly in the first category of sort of being, I didn't note anything about the body.
Maybe I have an old wording because we've updated it. I might have an old presentation, but in the self-awareness, there is a line about being aware about the thoughts, emotions, and body. I might have used an old an excuse. Thanks for pointing that out to me. That's because it's also funny, you know, we had two researchers doing the coding and they forgot about the body first. So we had to put it in.
Yeah, because the body is important, because everything emanates from the body, but often it's so obvious it's overlooked.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a huge important, because I think that especially the being and the relating is very hard when we become so disembodied. I mean, being by our computers and relating to each other through mail, many times we lose our bodies.
Yeah, exactly. And also creativity and art. Where does creativity and art play a role in the IDGs as you're framing them?
I mean, art is a huge part for us. we have, if you look at our webpage, there is this small 5 slides saying who we are. And one of the slides says, just because this stuff is serious doesn't mean it has to be boring. Where we say that we use art and music as part of our language, because I do think that we need to lead with that. If you look at all the movements, it's usually art that comes first, then philosophy, then the rest. And also here, there is a beautiful term with metamodernism, with the philosophy around this, that I could say is very close to the IDGs. But the art is, I mean, when we had the summit, I think half the summit was poets, musicians, theater groups interacting with the participants. So we really tried to bring it in how we live it, or co-learn from it, at least.
Yeah. And then also a question about nature, about the ecology, because we are obviously interconnected with the ecology. Are you assuming that the SDGs are dealing with the ecology, and so that the IDGs kind of leave it out, or how does the ecology fit in to your thinking?
And again, you're getting my thoughts now on this. So there are many different perspectives, but for me, I've been doing frequent nature quests for many years, and I'm meeting John Milton here in Stockholm, who has put many leaders out in nature for 5-10 days and just learn from being in nature. And from my understanding, I mean, we are nature, we are part of the ecology.
Yeah.
And that's the connectedness, the relating and connectedness comes in there. We've disconnected not only from our bodies, but also from nature. And this is why a lot of the things that are happening because we've lost that sense.
Exactly.
And I think there are beautiful practices that we can also point to, where we can help us reconnect to the ecology and work with ourselves and each other and show up in different ways, I guess.
Yeah, I would encourage the really looking at that, because I think the absence of the body, the absence of nature, as I'm viewing it, is a critical, not lack, but I think as you adjust, I would encourage you to adjust and be more explicit about the body and nature. And I say this because, as you know, we at Ubiquity University went through a similar process where we looked at all the studies that have been done around interior development, soft skills, transferable skills, the various names that they had, and we came up with 7. And the initial one is around also being and body and earth. And it feels to me that if we don't explicitly understand, particularly the earth, that we are nature, if we don't have that, Jan, at the core of our sense of being, it feels to me that we miss the whole point of why we're in the crisis in the first place. It's essentially a function of nature deficit disorder.
Yeah.
So, and then we built on that. And then the second one was cross-boundary team building and honoring diversity. And the third one was innovation and entrepreneurship and how you present yourself in action in the world. And then the fourth one was emotional intelligence and well-being, and then critical thinking, and then leadership, and then whole system design. So we covered with 7 soft skills, what you've kind of covered in 5. So it's a little bit a different model, but we overlooked it initially too at first. because we were looking at the psychological, the emotional, and then it was brought to our attention that this was categories that were absolutely critical in terms of people's sense of inner self-esteem. And also there, as you know, there's been a systemic critique for many years about the SDGs, that they don't include creativity and art as one of the categories that human beings everywhere need to emphasize. It's not just about industrial growth and politics, but it's about the imaginal realm and creativity and artistic expression, which is at the heart of what it means to actually be human in the first place.
I mean,
so
why
anyway,
are
those are issues we've been grappling with as well.
I agree, and I feel with you. It's like, what's the point? I mean, what's the point in doing all this if we don't have the art and creativity, if we don't bring it back to the body, and also, thank you for that.
Yeah, and maybe there's something that we could do together, to because we did our 7 key soft skills that are linked with the 17 SDGs. So we clustered the various SDGs that are associated with the various soft skills. And in this, we had a real interesting dialogue and partnership with UNESCO that had taken the time to develop the soft skills that were required for the successful completion of the Sustainable Development Goals. And so, in there somewhere are categories and courses and different, I would say, tonalities that we could all bring them together and develop courses around each of the categories so that people could really learn. That would be a wonderful potential way that we could collaborate together.
I'd love that. That's in phase 3 for us, starting September, a lot about the apply and testing out different ways and different ways to collaborate. What we've been really trying to do with this language, and it's, as you say, it's still on the back of a napkin, as you say.
Yeah.
So because we started this 2 years ago, and it's taking off. But I think one of the things is that the communication team is really, on the skill level at least, trying to keep it as simple as possible, so that we're spreading mostly through organizations and institutions, so that people in most organizations who are not as progressive as I think many of us who've been in the field of human development, and progressive in a way that, we've been giving it a lot of thought, to relate to that and be able to recognize themselves in it. And then but that's as a Trojan horse, as an entry point, and then I think we can also expand from there. So
yeah. Well, this is good. So let's then turn to how you're viewing the next phases. I know you had a quick slide on it, but as you look at the reality of the world today in relationship to these interdevelopment goals, what would you say your priorities are? Is it developing these hubs? Is it further refining the kind of the deck, as it were, and the scope? What are your priorities looking forward?
I mean, there are two. First of all, I mean, if we look at the inner-outer connection, it's a very new field in research. I mean, so just linking that if people grow in some inner capacities, that there will actually be a bigger chance that they will engage successfully with the Sustainable Development Goals. I mean, just that we have Templeton Foundation coming in and doing a study where we will test this hypothesis in 5 countries, Costa Rica being one of them, Rwanda probably another, and they want to sponsor in low or middle income countries. So proving, or at least exploring the inner-outer connection is one of the big things that we would like to look for partners and do together with others, and say, here is a group of people, they go through some kind of capacity building, and is there actually an effect in the way they enact towards the SDGs afterwards, or feel that they have the capacity to do so. But the best scenario is actually doing and having priorities that are more in line with SDGs. The second part is the validation study that I spoke about, where we have now Google. I'm trying to get some other international organizations, and I'm looking with somebody who is good with big data, who can help us process input from hundreds of thousands of people when we look at validating this framework and making it into a truly co-creative framework that can be used globally and that people can relate to. And the third part is the methods, and to create something that is where people can find inspiration to grow in whatever way they find is meaningful or helpful for them. So this is the three parts that we're aiming at in the next phase, and we're still designing it. And we're also when we had this summit, and I had a person from BMW Foundation, and he said, what was your budget that you did this earlier phase on? And I told him that it was $200,000. And he said, I've never seen something go global with. so basically, we're still on a shoestring budget. We're still not even one person fully employed. We're a small team with mostly people working part-time. Our big priority is now to continue to get corporate partners and to get some institutional funders so we can continue on this journey, because that has been one of the biggest challenges, is doing something that is going, as when Costa Rica came in and we realized, oh my God, we're going global, to try to do it with very limited resources and a small team is still the biggest challenge.
Gotcha. Well, we know that feeling here at Humanity Rising at Ubiquity. But I think there's a conversation that we might have around the educational aspects of what you're doing with some of the work that has already been done, but that we can talk about that separately. Then, as we conclude, Jan, I'd like to circle back to your original point about the fact that in many ways you got into this trying to answer deep personal questions rather than coming in as an expert, that just kind of knows the answer and here's 5 categories and so forth. How have you changed, or what's been the transformation in you personally as you've been developing the inner development goals?
I mean, the biggest, I think we're all children of our time and of our culture. And I'm from the West. And I think the Western mind, which Peter Senge many times have pointed out to, when we talk about inner or personal development, we think about individual development. And I realize how strong that bias has been in me, that I've been thinking that it's something that I do or that we do individually. And we just give me a good method or good tools, and I'll fix it. I mean, in a very naive way, if I exaggerate a bit, but I think some of the transformation has been in understanding how much of a collective process this is, and how much it's a question of culture and supporting structures and how we do it together, and how inner does not equal individual. That, I mean, in a felt sense, has been big for me, because it's one thing to understand it here, but it's another thing when it really lands in your heart and body.
Yeah. As you globalize, you realize that the world is really round, and that different cultures have different perceptions of what inner means and what outer means, and that this collective notion, the collective unconscious, the collective interior, we're seeing it in Ukraine and Russia. There's deeply held, passionately held interior beliefs that can grip an entire country. And then they play out in international politics. So I think that's a very important learning for you, and I think for all of us. We certainly go through this on a regular basis at Humanity Rising, because we have people registered from over 130 countries, and someone from one area of the world will say something, and someone from another area of the world will say, but wait a minute, that's not the way we look at it over here. And so you go through a process of opening up, which lowers your self-confidence that your perspective is actually universal in any way at all.
I'm gonna thank you for that reflection, and I'm gonna end by asking you the same question. Like, we spoke a few times, and you got attracted to the IDG framework, and like, what's the value or meaning that you see in this? What are you taking with you from this?
Yeah, good question. I would say, Jan, like you, we came into our journey with the soft skills and the SDGs in a deep sense of inquiry, and we've been refining them as we've been going along, as we've discovered, as we just discussed, that the interior of an individual and a culture and a family, a society, is a vast, untapped domain where language has less utility than in the external world. It's easier for us to name a tree as opposed to a car than it is to get into the subtleties of emotions across cultures. So I think for me, it's been a deeply humbling experience, and what I thought I knew so easily in the early stages has been deconstructed and has been reframed in ways that I didn't expect. But if you're really going to develop something globally, you've got to understand, for example, emotional intelligence means something completely different in China than it does in California. And I think initially, if you read Dan Goleman's book on emotional intelligence, you think, well, that's just the way it objectively is, but it's not. There's a whole different cultural matrix within which something like emotional intelligence takes shape. And in China, for example, which is your point, it's much more social. Emotional intelligence is much more socially defined and held, as opposed to the kind of I would say almost the radical individuality in the United States, and I would say in Western Europe generally. And so when you come into that cultural challenge, then how you adapt your categories in a way that continues to be meaningful is really where the rubber hits the road.
Yeah.
And I think you're going to be going through that, as we've been going through that, more and more as you try to adapt it on the ground in a way that keeps the initial integrity, but adapts it to the cultural diversity. So that's been a very deep learning for us as we've evolved this thing over the last, I would say, 4 years in our case. And you go through a period where a mountain is initially a mountain, and then the mountain is not a mountain as you come into cultural challenges. And then the mountain somehow becomes a mountain, but it looks completely different.
Yeah, I heard that expression before, and it's worth meditating on. The mountain that goes to not being a mountain and back to being a mountain.
And that's the journey. And that's the journey. And those are these inner skills that we have to develop, where what we think is true turns out to be challenged by its opposite. And a third thing emerges basically not our own, but through an intelligence that is far more complex and sophisticated when many minds come together around a common challenge. So that would be how I would begin to answer this. And so I would really want to stay in touch with you and see how we might collaborate together in various ways. So thank you, Jan. That brings our session to a close today, everyone. This is Jan Henriksen, along with many others, one of the prime movers in the Inner Development Goals, which is really at the frontier, I would say, of human evolutionary development, which after many years is coming to the stark realization that our interior is as important as our exterior. And it's a place where we're all quite primitive. And so it's a place where we need collaboration and we need humility. And one of the things that I would note about Jan today is his deep humility and his deep reverence for the search, for the journey that takes us to a deeper understanding of who we are and how we can better relate to each other and to the larger ecosystem at this critical moment in the human journey. So thank you, Jan. Thank you, everyone. You're all welcome to the after session chat group. You'll see the link in the chat box, and we'll see you here again tomorrow. Tomorrow, we're going to be talking about the magic and mystery of Chartres in France. There's a pilgrimage that's being developed by Ubiquity University to that sacred place, which has the tonality of the sacred feminine, and where people for thousands of years have become more fully themselves, more fully human through the pathway of adoration of the divine feminine. And that's potent in a place called Chartres. So that's what we're going to be exploring as we deepen our inquiry into our interior and how healing our interior can also heal the world. Thank you, everyone. See you here again tomorrow, same time, same station on Humanity Rising. Bye for now.